All right. Happy once again to be joined by the Massachusetts Senate Minority Leader, Senator Bruce Tarr from Gloucester. And Senator, I understand you're working a little bit locally today. Can I mention that?
You absolutely can, Rick. I was saying off air that this is one of my first broadcasts with you. I think it is my first broadcast originating from Cape Ann.
Awesome.
So I'm actually at my home here in West Gloucester. In fact, we probably could have done this interview with a can, 2 cans and a piece of string, because you're right down the street.
Exactly. I could have been out in your yard probably hollering, but it's great. And it's a beautiful day. The weather continues to be beautiful. And to where to start, I haven't seen you in a couple of weeks, but a lot going on. And with the changes that the pandemic and the state of emergency have caused here in Massachusetts, so many different things have changed fiscally. And maybe you could mention what's happening with the legislature with respect to the budget.
Sure. So the pace is really picking up on Beacon Hill, Rick, and mostly around the state budget. As we've talked about a couple of times, we have been postponing considering a budget for the remainder of fiscal year 2021, which started on July 1st. We've been continuing to operate state government through the use of interim budgets so that there's no shutdown and all of our state obligations are being met. But at some point, we have to do a budget for the remainder of the fiscal year. Governor Baker filed another interim budget just a couple of days ago to carry us through the end of November. And we're hoping that by the time that interim budget expires, we will have a budget for the rest of the year. Now, as we've talked about, the reasons that we've been postponing are twofold. One, we wanted to see, and we still hope, that the federal government will pass another stimulus package that will help states with our budgets. Obviously that hasn't happened, but we still hope it will. And we wanted to get a grip on tax revenue and where we would stand based on the economic damage that the pandemic has done. Well, about 2 weeks ago, the Ways and Means Committees and the Secretariat of Administration and Finance held a hearing with our series of experts that we always turn to, and basically asked the question, what can we expect from tax revenue for this fiscal year? And their predictions ranged from a shortfall of about $2 billion to about $5 billion.
Whoa.
And so with that information in hand, we can now try to feel our way through this budget cycle and try to get something done. Now, Governor Baker is particularly concerned about that because he's got to file the budget for the next fiscal year in January. So he really would like to see us, and I think we all would like to see us get this budget finalized before we have to begin working on the budget for the next fiscal year. So in order to get the process started, Governor Baker and Lieutenant Governor Polito have filed a revision to the original budget they filed in January. And I won't go into all of the details here, Rick, but I think it is important to talk about the basic parameters. And so that budget uses a projected revenue loss of about $3.5 to $3.6 billion. Now that's pretty much in the middle of where the experts had predicted that we're going to fall. So in order to close that gap, there are a bunch of different tools that are being used, but it's also important to remember that even though revenue is going down, the governor's revision for the budget is going up. And the reason for that is because of the pandemic, we have a lot more Medicaid caseload. In Massachusetts, we call it Mass Health. And so we've got to accommodate people that are relying on the state and through us, the federal government, for healthcare coverage and insurance because it's really critical. So that's the main reason the budget is going up, even as revenue is going down. Here's a couple of important things. Number one, the budget that the governor filed draws down about $1.35 billion from our state stabilization fund. Now, what's really important is that stabilization fund has $3.5 billion in it. And credit to everyone involved, since 2015, our stabilization fund has tripled in size, leaving us now with some resources to help mitigate the effects of the pandemic. So the governor in his budget solve would draw about $1.35 billion, still leaving us with about $2.21 billion because we think we're going to need resources from the stabilization fund for next year. Couple of other quick things. Number one, the budget does not raise taxes. Number two, it does not reduce eligibility and coverage for our human services programs. And number three, it level funds local aid for our cities and towns and Chapter 70 aid for our school districts. Now, within those parameters, there are a lot of moving pieces, and I won't get into all the details here, but I want to remind folks that in order to accomplish those positive things that I just described, there will have to be cuts, and we will have to come to grips with those. But we are now on the path to doing that, and my expectation is that in the month of November, the House will go first. They will debate their version of this budget, and we will go next in the Senate. And I believe that the budget debate itself will be concluded certainly by the end of November, and then we have to reconcile the House and the Senate versions. I don't think that is going to be the extensive process this year that it usually is, because I think both branches will keep their budgets very narrow and so that they can be reconciled easily and we can get something to the governor's desk. I know that's a mouthful, but I think it's important information that I wanted to share.
Just as an aside, it seems to me that this is sort of a fly by the seat of your pants thing due to the pandemic. And it sounds, Senator, that there's good cooperation among the legislature and probably or possibly the cities and towns in getting this thing to work, because it's so brand new, and all the things that have come at the state legislature all at once have had you with a whole bunch of balls up in the air. So it sounds, I know that there's a shortfall and things are going to have to, you're going to have to tighten the belt somewhere, but it sounds fairly optimistic.
I am optimistic about getting a budget done that's able to meet our priorities and that doesn't create an increased tax burden on folks in the middle of a pandemic when we have such high rates of unemployment and so many people out of work and so many businesses struggling. So to the extent that there can be optimism in this situation, Rick, I do think there is some, and I hold that optimism for our ability to get through this. But even as we're processing through this budget, we're thinking about fiscal year 2022, right. And the early signs are that could be even more difficult. So this is definitely a day-by-day situation, and I couldn't agree with you more that there is tremendous collaboration happening between the House and the Senate, between Republicans and Democrats, between the legislature and the governor. And that's why, because of that focused effort, I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to get a budget done soon that is as good as it can be under the circumstances.
Sounds optimistic. On the other side of the coin, I read something about evictions and that has been lifted, or there's more. I don't understand that. Can you explain what's going on with
Sure. No, I'm happy to do it. One of the things that we've been concerned about, particularly since the declaration of the public health emergency back in March, is people being evicted and having no place to live. Now, that's bad enough on its own, but in the era of a pandemic, it's bad because people then might go to visit a friend and live with a friend, and so they're congregating in a household that they weren't part of before, and that can increase the transmission of COVID-19. So in order to respond to that immediately, the governor had issued an executive order and did an extension of that executive order to basically prohibit evictions. And that lasted through October 17th, and so it has just expired. And in its place, because this is still a very serious issue, the governor and the legislature worked with the trial courts to work out a plan to deal with eviction and try to keep people in their homes. Now, the governor is attempting to put about $171 million on the table, and $100 million of that, Rick, would go to something called RAFT, which is a program that we have to pay for rental arrearages. So if someone is falling behind, they can apply for RAFT, they can get the money to pay their back rent. They need to pay it to the landlord in that case because the landlord's depending on that money as well. But hopefully we can prevent evictions that way. And the rest of that money is intended to help the courts with people to deal with mediation and triaging cases and being able to work through this situation, because we really don't want to be in a situation where there are a lot of judicial decisions about eviction. We want to try to prevent that. But we also need, again, to make sure that the people that are renting the housing are not evicted, and the people that are providing the housing are not destabilized financially to the extent where they can't offer the housing or pay for things like property taxes and utilities. So there's a lot of work being done on this. All of that being said, there is also still a national eviction moratorium in place through the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. It also affects people in Massachusetts, a subset of the ones that were covered by the governor's executive order. But the point is this, the order itself, the moratorium, has lapsed. There is a federal one, but there is also a tremendous collaborative effort on the part of state government to move forward and to provide the tools we need to prevent an eviction crisis in the middle of a public health crisis.
And also, the Senate recently has passed an economic recovery plan.
Well, there's an economic recovery plan, Rick, that was announced just yesterday, in fact, by the governor and the lieutenant governor. And it includes a number of different categories of things, but some of those things are already in place. Some of them are being proposed. Some of them have been approved already by the legislature and others have not. And so this is a very complicated package. The total amount of resources in it is $774 million. And it responds to the real need that we have to not only protect public health, but also protect the economy against the economic damage that's being done by the COVID-19 pandemic. And if there's one thing that I think is a major takeaway for right now in that package, it's that there is a $50.8 million grant program being administered by the Massachusetts Growth Capital Corporation, and small businesses can apply right now, and we want them to. And basically the way that it works is if you have between 6 and 50 employees, you can get a grant of up to $75,000. If you have less than 6 employees, you can get a grant of $25,000. So these are grants and not loans. And on the MGCC website, the Massachusetts Growth Capital Corporation, you can get the application and you can apply. And this is really an attempt to pick up on people that maybe didn't get the payroll protection plan resources that the federal government had put forward, or got those resources and have exhausted them. And this is our state attempt to continue the momentum in the absence of an additional federal stimulus package. This is really important. And again, there are other dimensions to it. For instance, there's $10 million to help museums and cultural venues, which are so important in our area. And also another $10 million for the Shared Streets program to help cities and towns modify their streetscapes to help restaurants and retailers. And I know that, for instance, in the round that has not yet been awarded but is closed, Gloucester had applied for money to be able to help restaurants buy patio heaters to be able to continue outdoor dining into the fall season. So there's a lot happening with this. We are posting about it on social media, on tartalk.com, and also on my Facebook page. And I would really want people to know, Rick, that if they're interested, if they need help navigating all of this, because it's very complicated, they can certainly reach out to us either by phone at 617-722-1600 or by email at bruce.tarr@masenate.gov. And also, I know that Representative Ferranti is ready to prepare and prepared to help as well. And she's done also a lot of work on the economic development front.
One final question. I know you have another appointment you have to get to rather quickly here. Your view of the so-called spike in COVID-19 positive testing?
I'm concerned about it, Rick. We've got a situation where Massachusetts has been very proactive. There have been a lot of hard decisions made to restrict people's mobility in some cases and the way that we live our lives. And those things have helped to control the spread in Massachusetts particularly well compared to other states. But what we've always been worried about is that we get back to colder weather and people begin congregating, that we might see increased transmission of COVID-19. And also as COVID fatigue sets in, as people get weary of doing all the things that we have to do to protect ourselves and our neighbors, that we would start to backslide. And that is what we're seeing. We've had some of the highest case numbers in the last few days that we've had since the spring. And we've got positive test rates that were just in September between 1 and 2%, now approaching 5% as of this past Wednesday. And we have 77 communities, including Gloucester, that are in the red zone on the Department of Public Health map. All of this to me adds up to the fact that we need to redouble our efforts. And a lot of credit here goes to our local boards of health. The Board of Health in Gloucester and our health director, Karen Carroll, have done a remarkable job of contact tracing and getting testing. I know, Rick, you're aware of that. It's been happening at Stage Fort Park. It's going to happen again tomorrow on Saturday at Stage Fort Park. So that kind of response is very heartening, but the most important thing is trying to be proactive and not having to be reactive. And that's up to all of us to do those basic things that we talk about so often: wearing a mask, sanitizing surfaces, washing our hands, keeping socially distanced. Those things are really important, and they're critically important right now as we see this spike in cases.